Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a molecule that stirs up just so many ideas, myths, and debates. Maybe more than any other hormone,
Mm.
testosterone.
Hmm.
It's often the go-to explanation for, everything from muscle mass to aggression, seen as the driver of male behavior.
And the source material you've given us for this deep dive is, well, it's incredibly rich. A mix of fascinating research findings, personal accounts, articles, notes. It really lets us explore not just the complex science, but also those really powerful societal perceptions around testosterone.
Absolutely. So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and cut through all that noise. What does the science actually tell us about what testosterone does? How does it connect to complex human stuff like aggression and sexuality?
Right.
What are its undeniable effects on our bodies? And, how has society woven its own narrative around this powerful chemical messenger? We're going to try and make sense of it all for you.
What immediately jumps out from these sources is the huge gap, really, between those popular ideas and what the science actually says.
Right. You see these really vivid personal stories like Andrew Sullivan's account of feeling this surge of energy drive, and he says, quote, above all, horniness from tea injections.
Yeah, that one's quite striking.
And alongside that, you find these sweeping ideas linking tea to what some call toxic masculine phenotypes, driving men up social ladders, or even explaining defense mechanisms. Just big claims.
And it gets pulled into politics, too, which the sources capture really well. You see one left-leaning source describing the Trump presidency as testosterone-fueled and dangerous, even implying it could lead to war. But then, conversely, a right-leaning source critiques prominent conservatives for supposedly having low testosterone, painting them as ineffective, compared to the Trump base, which that source describes as fighting a war. It's really interesting how tea becomes this stand-in, literally or metaphorically, for certain qualities in these political arguments. And just to be clear, we're just reporting what the sources say here, not taking sides or endorsing any of those views.
Totally. No, that's important context. And then there's this other idea, almost moralistic, what one source calls a testosterone curse. This suggestion that high T inevitably leads to sexual transgressions.
Yeah, it paints men under T's influence as just, quote, animals who view women solely as objects for lascivious gratification. It's quite a negative portrayal.
So you end up with this really confusing picture. Too much tea is bad, toxic even, but too little is emasculating, and somehow just the right amount is the secret sauce for vigor and success. It's kind of contradictory.
It really is.
It makes you wonder, like one source explicitly asks, is any of this actually true? Or is it mostly popular myth, maybe even one with a problematic kind of sexist history?
Well, the scientific consensus the sources present is much more focused, much more grounded. They say that testosterone's primary role, especially across the animal kingdom, is really about supporting the anatomy, physiology, and behaviors that maximize a male's reproductive output.
Okay.
For men, that translates to helping reproduction and directing energy towards things like competing for mates. That's the biological core function.
Okay, so let's connect that fundamental role to sex differences, which the sources also dig into quite a bit. Sex differences being just the average differences between males and females in a species.
Exactly. And the sources are careful to note, identifying a difference doesn't automatically tell you the cause, right?
Right.
And features aren't strictly exclusive. There are small differences, maybe subtle average differences in some skills, or obvious ones like names, though the source humorously mentions men named Shirley.
Yeah.
But then there are very significant differences, and the sources highlight two big ones: attraction patterns and, crucially for this discussion, physical aggression.
And the statistics the sources cite on male physical aggression are, well, they're quite stark, aren't they?
They are. Men reportedly responsible for around 70% of traffic fatalities, a staggering 98% of mass shootings in the U.S., over 95% of homicides worldwide.
95%.
Wow. And the overwhelming majority of other violent acts, including sexual assault. It's a very skewed picture.
That pattern seems to echo what you see throughout the animal kingdom, right? Aggression is fundamental for animals competing for resources, mates, Basically, reproductive success.
Absolutely. And because competition for mates is often shaped by sexual selection, this kind of overt aggression is primarily concentrated in males in many, many species.
So the big question then is, could human males be the major exception to that pattern, despite those, sobering statistics we just mentioned?
The source material suggests it's unlikely they're a complete exception. They point out that T's role in male violence is pretty well established in lots of non-human animals, making it plausible, at least, that humans share some of those underlying biological drivers.
Okay, let's zoom in on human aggression then, because it's definitely more complex than just those overall stats suggest.
For sure.
The sources bring this to life with some really vivid examples, like Damon Fairless's personal account of a confrontation on the subway. He describes the feeling as, quote, a growing itch, a form of lust, a predatory hard-on. I want him on his knees, subjugated, scared.
Woo! That's a really powerful, visceral description of direct aggression, almost primal.
It is.
Oh!
But it's absolutely vital, and the sources make this point very clear, not to fall into the trap of thinking only men are aggressive or capable of extreme violence.
Crucial point, yes. The sources include the horrifying example from the Rwanda genocide detailing how Pauline Nairamasuhuko, a government minister, was convicted partly for ordering militia members to rape women and girls before killing them.
God, that's chilling.
It's a chilling reminder of women's capacity for promoting and carrying out extreme violence. It complicates the simple narrative.
Absolutely. And another area the sources highlight that really challenges simple stereotypes is intimate partner violence, or IPV. It's tragically common, but maybe often misunderstood.
That's right. While men are frequently the main perpetrators of severe harm in IPV, the sources present data suggesting that in Western countries, women's rates of physical aggression within relationships might actually be as high as men's.
Wait, as high? How do they define that?
So this is specifically about the frequency of physically aggressive acts, things like pushing, slapping, hitting. It's not necessarily about the severity of the injury caused or the motivations behind it, and it doesn't cover other important forms of abuse like coercive control, which the sources also discuss. But just looking at acts of physical aggression.
The frequency might be similar, yeah.
Yeah. They even mention a Detroit study where wives were found to be more frequent perpetrators of physical assault using weapons like knives and guns. And a multi-city European study found men and women reported equivalent rates of both perpetration and victimization for most acts, except for sexual coercion, which was overwhelmingly perpetrated by men.
Okay, I can see how encountering that data might feel counterintuitive, like the sources say. It kind of clashes with the typical picture.
It does initially, but they argue that when you look closely at the evidence and how these things are measured, it starts to make sense. It forces a more nuanced view.
And here's where the difference in outcome becomes absolutely critical, right? Even if the frequency of some aggressive acts is similar.
Precisely. Women are far less likely to inflict serious physical damage. Men cause significantly more damage, especially lethal damage. The sources grimly note that worldwide, women are 6 times more likely to die by partner homicide than men.
6 times. That puts the frequency data in perspective. And the sources explore reasons for that difference in outcome.
They do. The obvious one is the average difference in size and strength, especially in heterosexual relationships. That physical asymmetry matters.
Makes sense.
But psychological factors are also discussed. Empathy. That ability to understand how others are feeling is something men, on average, across many cultures, seem less attuned to than women.
Less empathy, okay.
And this isn't just humans. It's observed in male non-human animals, too, like chimps or wolves, who generally show lower rates of caregiving, cooperating, comforting behaviors compared to females. Reduced empathy could potentially compound the effects of greater strength and might help explain why men are more likely to escalate to severe violence or use lethal weapons.
The sources also touch on potential differences in why violence occurs in IPV, the motivation.
Yes. They suggest men might be more likely to use violence as a form of coercive control, maybe to prevent a partner from leaving or being unfaithful, whereas women, globally, when they inflict serious injury or kill a partner, it's more often found to be in response to a history of severe threats or abuse, often framed as self-defense or protecting children or family.
So aggression isn't just one thing, it's complex. The sources break it down into different types, right?
Yeah. Exactly. There's direct aggression, like that subway story, physical confrontation, shouting, raising a fist. Very overt.
And then there's what they call indirect aggression, which they suggest might be kind of unique to humans.
Yeah, using language or social manipulation to get others to do the dirty work, spreading rumors, orchestrating social exclusion, that sort of thing.
The high school mean girls trope is like
Yeah.
the classic illustration of that.
Perfect example. And the sources note that while boys and men definitely do this too, girls and women seem to have what they term an affinity for it, maybe rely on it more often.
Interesting. And then there's maternal aggression.
Right. This is that powerful, fierce aggression you see in female animals when their offspring are threatened. Think of a mother bear or even just a human mom yelling at a driver who almost hits her kid.
Yeah, you don't mess with that.
Definitely serves reproductive goals protecting the young. But the sources point out it doesn't seem linked to testosterone. Studies show it's actually increased by pregnancy and lactation hormones like prolactin and oxytocin, different hormonal basis.
Okay, so summing up these aggression types from the sources. If you define aggression really broadly, including indirect stuff, maternal defense, intimate conflict, you could argue human females are just as capable of aggression, just as prone to anger as males.
You could make that case, yeah.
Per UT, if you narrow the definition to aggression involving physical risk to yourself and inflicting serious bodily damage, things like headbutting, rape, murder, then the sources conclude that men, quote, win, hands down.
That's the distinction they draw based on the evidence presented. They also briefly mention another classification, reactive versus proactive aggression.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
Reactive is that hot, impulsive burst, like screaming and throwing things immediately if you catch your partner cheating. Proactive is more cold, calculated revenge, plotting to take photos later and dox someone online, for instance.
Ah, okay. Like a crime of passion versus premeditated.
Kind of. The sources note this classification exists, but they don't explicitly link it back to T or sex differences in the excerpts we have. Just another way to think about aggression.
Okay, so we've established T is linked to aggression, particularly the physically damaging kind, more common in males. But how does it actually fuel this drive for competition and aggression? It's not just about having a high baseline level, is it?
No, not at all. That's a common misconception. The sources introduced this really fascinating idea that T levels can change rapidly, like moment to moment, in response to competitive situations.
Rapidly, okay.
Yeah, the theory is this helps men quickly assess their chances and make adaptive responses. Am I likely to win this? Should I push forward or back off?
The World Cup soccer fan study mentioned in the sources is a great example of that, right?
Perfect example. Brazilian fans' T either stayed the same or went up after their team won. Italian fans' T plummeted after their team lost. This winner-loser effect has been seen in lots of studies.
Even in things like chess or video games, not just physical stuff.
Exactly. Though the sources note it's not always perfectly consistent. It can depend on how much someone actually cares about the outcome. But the general pattern is there.
And the underlying logic is adaptive.
Very adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. Winning gives you evidence you're good at competing, so maybe capitalize on that success, push your advantage. Losing suggests you're outmatched, so caution is probably wise. Getting beaten up repeatedly isn't great for your dating prospects, right?
Yeah, probably not.
And the sources mention this effect is mediated by T in non-human animals, like Syrian hamsters. Leasing makes them less aggressive, more cautious. But if you give them T, it blocks that cautious response.
So in humans, how might those T changes actually work in the brain?
Well, the sources suggest these rapid shifts in T provide information to the brain, basically changing how sensitive you are to other hormones and neurotransmitters involved in perceiving and responding to threats.
Like making you feel fear differently.
Potentially, yeah. If your T is low or falling after a loss, you might become more sensitive to fear, pain, or anxiety. That makes you more likely to retreat, which could save you from further harm. Adaptive. If your T rises after a win, you might feel bolder, less fearful, more motivated to push forward or defend your newfound status. Also adaptive, potentially.
But you said earlier T's relationship with aggression isn't simple cause and effect. What's the nuance here? It's not just about winning or losing, triggering T changes.
Right. It's hugely modulated by individual factors, your past experiences, your personality, and crucially, the social hierarchy you're operating in.
The social context.
Exactly. The Talapoin monkey experiment is a fantastic illustration of this. When researchers increased T in these monkeys, they didn't just become randomly aggressive.
No.
No, they increased aggression only towards monkeys below them in the status hierarchy. They stayed perfectly polite, even submissive to the higher-ups.
Wow, so T amplifies behavior appropriate to the context.
Precisely. The source quotes Robert Sapolsky joking that if you gave Buddhist monks testosterone, they wouldn't start touching people. They'd probably just perform random acts of amplified kindness. T tends to facilitate the behaviors the situation calls for based on the individual's tendencies and social position.
Okay, this is where recent research, like those studies by Geniol and Correa mentioned in the sources, adds even more detail, bringing in personality factors.
Yes, this is really important work. They looked at experimentally raising T levels in men using a gel, but they also measured personality traits.
Specifically.
They identified dominance-oriented men, guys who are naturally assertive, forceful, confident, really motivated by status or power. And they also looked at lack of self-control or impulsivity.
And the key finding was?
Elevated T didn't just increase aggression across the board. It increased aggression primarily in the men who were both dominance-oriented and impulsive.
Ah, so you need that specific combination.
Seems like it. This is a crucial piece because it might explain why previous studies on T and aggression were sometimes inconsistent. Maybe they weren't accounting for these essential personality moderators. You need that specific personality cocktail maybe for the T boost to really manifest as heightened aggression.
The sources describe a big experiment, the PSAP study, where men got either T gel or a placebo, then played a game where they could earn points or choose to pay points to steal points from opponents. That was the lab measure of aggression.
Right, the point subtraction aggression paradigm. And it confirmed the earlier findings. The T-gel did increase point-stealing aggression, but again, it was mainly in those same dominance-oriented, impulsive men.
And the sources emphasized these guys were willing to, quote, pay just to behave aggressively when provoked in the game. It wasn't about gaining points, just about retaliating.
Exactly. Which suggests T might be influencing the motivation or maybe even the reward value of aggression itself in these specific individuals.
Now, things get even more complex when you add genetics, right? The sources mentioned the androgen receptor gene and something called the CAG repeat length.
That's right. Okay, so think of the androgen receptor gene as providing the instructions for building the docking station in your cells, where testosterone actually connects to deliver its message.
Got it.
And the CAG repeat length is a little section within that gene's instructions that repeats a certain number of times, CAG, CAG, CAG. The sources explain that having fewer of these repeats results in a more efficient docking station. It means your cells are more sensitive to the testosterone signal that's present.
More sensitive with fewer repeats.
Okay.
And how did that play into the aggression findings?
Well, among those dominance-oriented, impulsive men, the ones who also had shorter CAG repeats, meaning they were genetically more sensitive to T, showed even more aggression in response to the experimental T-gel compared to similar men with longer repeats.
Wow. So it's T level plus personality plus genetic sensitivity interacting.
Exactly. It's multi-layered.
And was there a link to pleasure or reward, like you suggested?
Yes. Men with those shorter CAG repeats also reported feeling more pleasure from being aggressive in the experiment.
Huh. Why would aggression feel pleasurable?
The potential mechanism the sources suggest involves dopamine and the brain's reward pathways. T seems to increase sensitivity to reward, particularly in brain areas that are rich in both dopamine pathways and androgen receptors. From an evolutionary standpoint, winning a competition or intimidating a rival was highly adaptive for males.
Yeah, for status and mating.
So achieving that might trigger a dopamine release, reinforcing the behavior because it literally feels good. Animal studies support this. They show T increases dopamine release after winning and can even increase the number of dopamine receptors available.
Okay, so the big takeaway from all this complexity isn't that T is irrelevant, but that it's, well, it's complicated.
It's definitely complicated. T increases motivation and makes aggression potentially more rewarding, but primarily in some men under the right circumstances with the right personality traits and potentially influenced by the right genetic makeup of their androgen receptors.
That makes so much more sense than just T causes aggression.
Exactly. The sources argue that understanding this complexity actually strengthens our understanding of T's role. It doesn't weaken it. They also note T has other effects that can make severe aggression more likely in those contexts, like reducing empathy slightly, increasing motivation, decreasing fear and pain perception, allowing someone to push through barriers they might otherwise heed.
And reducing T reverses that.
Generally, yes. It tends to make animals more sensitive to pain and fear, more likely to flee when threatened, which is adaptive if you're likely to lose a fight.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. From aggression to another area where T's influence is heavily discussed.
Yeah.
Sexuality. The sources say tea has these well-documented effects on anatomy and behavior, especially aggression and sexuality.
Yeah, these two often go hand in hand in discussions about tea. And this brings us to the famous, or maybe infamous, Coolidge effect.
Ah, yes, the Coolidge effect. Explain that again.
It's the phenomenon observed primarily in males across many species where sexual arousal tends to decrease or wane with a familiar partner, but is quickly rekindled by exposure to a novel, unfamiliar partner.
The story about President Coolidge visiting a chicken farm is the classic illustration, right? He asks the farmer how often the rooster mates. The farmer says dozens of times a day. Coolidge says, "Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge."
Exactly. Then Mrs. Coolidge comes along, asks if the rooster mates with the same hen each time. The farmer says, "Oh no, a different one every time." And she says, "Tell that to Mr. Coolidge."
Huh. Even if it's apocryphal, it gets the point across perfectly.
It really does. And there's solid evidence for the Coolidge effect, not just in non-human animals like rats, but also in humans.
How do they study this in humans, though? Beyond just asking people in surveys.
Well, surveys are one piece of the puzzle. Large cross-cultural studies consistently show that men, on average, report higher libido and a greater preference for sexual variety than women. Though, importantly, the sources note cultural influences are huge here, too. Think differing views on premarital sex in, say, Denmark versus Pakistan, as one source mentions.
But self-report can be unreliable, right? People might not be totally honest about sex.
No, true. Although researchers use methods to check for consistency and things like social desirability bias. But then there are more objective measures. The sources mentioned the penile plethysmograph.
Right, the device that measures changes in penile circumference.
Yep. And they use the rather blunt phrase, quote, "the penis never lies."
Okay, keeping it clinical here.
Yeah.
And what do studies using that find? Do they back up the surveys?
They generally do. They confirm that men's measured physiological arousal patterns match the Coolidge effect. Arousal tends to decrease with repeated exposure to the same sexual stimuli, like the same actors in a pornographic film, but is quickly renewed when novel stimuli, like new actors, are introduced.
Interesting.
And other physical measures, like the time it takes to ejaculate, ejaculation volume, even sperm hardiness, also show this renewal effect with novelty in some studies.
So the Coolidge effect seems pretty robust in men, regardless of their sexual orientation, according to the sources, but much weaker, or maybe just different in women.
That's the pattern the sources describe based on the available evidence, and it's supported by a lot of other converging lines of evidence they present.
Like what?
Things like men, on average, masturbating more frequently than women, and as one source colorfully puts it, sometimes making more stupid mistakes while doing it, neutrally referencing the Jeffrey Toobin incident as it appeared in the source material.
Oh.
Also, men being the primary consumers of pornography worldwide, often preferring content with less emotional foreplay, as one source puts it. Men fantasizing more often about strangers or multiple partners, being almost exclusively the clients of prostitutes globally, being more likely to use infidelity websites. And studies consistently showing men tend to respond more positively to casual sex invitations from strangers compared to women.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot of converging evidence pointing towards a pretty consistent average sex difference in sexual motivation and that preference for variety. So is testosterone the culprit, so to speak?
Well, culprit might be loaded language, but the sources suggest T's role is highly plausible, especially given human evolutionary history where male reproductive success was often linked to gaining sexual access to multiple mates and competing with other males for that access.
So T drives the motivation.
It seems to strongly influence male sexual motivation, the drive, the interest, and also the sensitivity to reward from sexual activity. Higher T levels in male animals across species clearly increase interest in sex and mating-related behaviors. It gets them seeking it out.
How does that compare to T's role in female sexuality? Is it just absent?
No, not absent. T is present in female animals and women, and it is involved in their sexual motivation, too. But the sources emphasize it's generally not seen as being as essential or as central to libido across species as it is for males.
Meaning female desire works differently.
Yeah, female sexual motivation, the sources note, seems much more complex overall. It's influenced significantly by other hormones like estrogen and progesterone, and it functions perfectly well, with typical female hormone levels. T contributes, but it's not the primary driver in the same way it appears to be for male libido.
Okay, so the fact that T is essential for male, but maybe not essential for female sexuality, doesn't automatically mean men are inherently sex fiends and women are passive, right?
No, not at all. That's a simplistic stereotype. The sources point back to the irony in that Coolidge joke. Mrs. Coolidge is the one portrayed as wanting more sex, just, with variety. It's more about different hormonal pathways influencing different patterns of desire, response, and maybe novelty seeking, not dictating whether someone desires sex or not.
Okay, that's clearer. Now, sticking with P and sex, let's talk about sexual orientation. You mentioned rat studies earlier, inducing homosexual behavior. Are there really gay rats?
Well, the sources clarify that while exclusive lifelong homosexuality seems rare in non-humans, domestic sheep are mentioned as a possible exception. Non-exclusive same-sex sexual behavior is actually pretty common across the animal kingdom. Including in rats, you can see females mounting other females, or males adopting the receptive lordosis pose usually seen in females.
And researchers can actually manipulate this behavior by changing T exposure early on.
Yes, by carefully manipulating T levels during specific sensitive periods in development, which in rats is actually just after birth. If you give a female rat high T during that early sensitive period and then again in adulthood, she's more likely to show mounting behavior towards other females.
And the reverse for males.
Conversely, if you castrate a male rat early on, removing his T source, and then treat him with female hormones like estrogen and progesterone in adulthood, he might adopt that receptive lordosis pose when mounted by another male. It shows hormones during critical developmental windows can powerfully shape later sexual behavior patterns in these models.
So the huge question is, do similar early hormonal effects happen in humans and influence our sexual orientation?
That's the million-dollar question and a really fascinating hypothesis. The sources introduce childhood gender atypical behavior as a potential indirect link.
How so?
Well, studies consistently find that boys who strongly avoid rough-and-tumble play and prefer things typically associated with girls, like dolls or dress-up, are statistically more likely to grow up identifying as gay or bisexual.
And for girls?
And girls who strongly shun dresses, prefer rougher sports, and play primarily with boys, the classic tomboys, are statistically more likely to grow up identifying as lesbian or bisexual. And importantly, this association seems to hold up across many diverse cultures.
The sources cite that classic Richard Green study, right? Following boys with extensive cross-gender behavior.
Yes, a landmark longitudinal study. He found that about 75% of the boys who showed intense, persistent cross-gender behavior grew up to be gay or bisexual, compared to almost none in a control group of gender-typical boys. And crucially, the sources note this behavior often persisted despite, quote, strong social discouragement. It wasn't easily suppressed.
So the hypothesis emerging from this was related to prenatal hormones.
Exactly. The hypothesis was that perhaps these highly feminine boys had experienced lower than typical exposure to testosterone before birth, during critical periods of brain development, affecting their brain organization, subsequent childhood play preferences, and later sexual orientation.
And conversely, maybe highly masculine girls, the tomboys, had higher prenatal T exposure.
That's the flip side of the hypothesis. And is there direct evidence for that, particularly for prenatal T influencing female development in that way?
Yes, the strongest human evidence the sources discuss comes from individuals with specific genetic conditions affecting hormone production. They talk about girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH.
Right, CAH. What happens there?
It's a genetic condition where, before birth, the adrenal glands produce unusually high levels of androgens, including testosterone. And girls born with CAH are much more likely than other girls to be tomboys in childhood. They're more likely to pursue traditionally male-dominated occupations later in life.
And their sexual orientation.
And they are significantly overrepresented among lesbians and bisexual women. The sources cite figures around 30% not being exclusively heterosexual, which is far higher than the general population rate.
Wow, 30%. That's a strong link.
And on the other side, they mention CAS individuals who have XY chromosomes, so genetically male, but their bodies are completely insensitive to androgens like testosterone due to a faulty receptor gene.
So T is present, but the body can't hear its signal.
Exactly. And these CAIS individuals, developed physically as females, are indistinguishable from typical XX girls in their childhood play preferences, very feminine, and grow up almost exclusively attracted to men. So the presence or absence of T's effect during development seems strongly linked to these outcomes in these specific cases.
Okay, but those are, as you said, specific, somewhat extreme conditions affecting hormone exposure or response. What about the vast majority of people whose T levels fall within the typical range? Is there evidence linking variations within that normal range to sexual orientation?
That's where it gets much, much harder to study reliably in humans. The big challenge is measuring someone's actual prenatal T exposure during the critical period for brain differentiation, thought to be roughly weeks 8 to 18 of pregnancy.
How would you even measure that?
Exactly. Measuring T in amniotic fluid samples or umbilical cord blood at birth isn't a perfect snapshot of what the developing fetal brain was actually experiencing weeks or months earlier. And we don't even know the precise timing of all the critical windows for different aspects of brain development.
Right, so it's technically very difficult.
Which is why studies trying to directly link prenatal T measurements to sexual orientation in the general population have produced pretty inconsistent results so far. It's hard to get a clear signal.
The sources mention another, maybe more indirect method used to estimate prenatal T exposure, the digit ratio.
Ah, yes, the 2D.4D ratio, the ratio of the length of the index finger, 2D, to the ring finger, 4D.
And the pattern is supposed to be what again?
Typically in women, the index finger is about the same length or slightly longer than the ring finger, giving a ratio close to or slightly above 1. In men, the ring finger is usually longer than the index finger, leading to a lower ratio, below 1. So a lower masculine ratio is thought to reflect higher prenatal T exposure.
And does this hold up in those conditions like CAH?
Yes. The sources note that girls with CAH do tend to have a lower, more masculine digit ratio on average compared to unaffected girls.
Okay, so maybe there's something to it.
Yeah.
But the sources also add some pretty big caveats about using digit ratio, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. They call it a noisy signal. Many things besides prenatal hormones can influence finger lengths. It's considered a very blunt tool, especially for making claims about any single individual.
Probably more useful, if at all, for looking at average differences between large groups and studies.
Maybe. But even then, the sources mention the potential for publication-biased studies that happen to find a significant result are more likely to get published than those that don't. And studies looking at digit ratio and sexual orientation have really shown mixed results.
How so?
Some studies find lesbians, on average, have a lower, more masculine ratio, supporting the prenatal T idea for women. But other studies find no difference. And importantly, digit ratio studies have shown very little evidence linking gay men to lower prenatal T exposure, which would be predicted by the simplest version of the hormonal theory. If anything, some studies find gay men have similar or even slightly more masculine ratios than straight men.
Okay. So not strong support there for the low T idea in gay men.
In fact, the sources push back a bit more on a simple low T theory for gay men by citing a study, just one study, mind you, that found gay men actually had slightly bigger penises on average than straight men when erect.
Bigger? How is that relevant?
Because penis size is known to be positively correlated with early testosterone exposure during gestation. So finding larger average size would argue against gay men having had lower prenatal T exposure, if anything.
Okay, interesting twist. So to wrap up this complex T and sexual orientation discussion based on the sources, T clearly has undeniable effects on anatomy and behaviors like aggression and general sexual drive. But understanding its potential role in shaping sexual orientation is, well, it's really complex and still debated. The evidence for a link, particularly through early hormonal exposure, seems stronger and more consistent in women, mostly based on that CAH data, than it currently does for men. Is that a fair summary?
I think that captures what the sources convey. It's not straightforward, especially for men.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit provocative. The sources propose that maybe gay men, paradoxically, can teach us a lot about the fundamental nature of male sexual behavior, particularly that preference for novelty we talked about earlier with the Coolidge effect.
How so?
Well, Andrew Sullivan's article, which is quoted in the sources, uses this old, kind of edgy joke. What does a lesbian bring on a second date? A U-Haul. What does a gay man bring on a second date? What second date?
Huh. Okay, yeah, that definitely plays on stereotypes. But the sources suggest there might be a kernel of truth in there, statistically speaking.
Yes, they present data indicating that, on average, gay men report having significantly more sexual partners over their lifetime compared to straight men, and especially compared to lesbians. And conversely, lesbians, on average, are much more likely to be sexual, primarily within the context of committed monogamous relationships, similar to heterosexual women.
And crucially, the sources point out that gay people don't generally show gender atypical patterns in other aspects of sexuality, right? Like overall libido, desire for casual sex, or even preferences for age or physical appearance in partners compared to their straight counterparts of the same sex.
Exactly. This is a key point they make. For example, even gay men who are highly gender atypical in their childhood playstyles don't seem to have feminized adult sexual behavior patterns, aside from their choice of partner sex. They still show typical male patterns of interest in visual stimuli, focus on youth looks, and higher average interest in casual sex compared to lesbians or straight women.
And similarly, lesbians and heterosexual women, regardless of their orientation, tend to be more similar to each other. More emphasis on emotional connection, more inclination towards monogamy, less interest in casual sex, reporting desire for fewer lifetime partners compared to both gay and heterosexual men.
Right. So the provocative conclusion the sources draw from synthesizing all this is that adults with male levels of T tend to exhibit the sexual proclivities and patterns typical of men: higher drive, greater interest in novelty variety, and those with female levels of T and hormonal profiles tend to exhibit the patterns typical of women, often more emphasis on connection, less driven by novelty alone, regardless of the sex of the person they are attracted to.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. T levels driving the pattern of sexuality, while orientation determines the target.
It fits with Andrew Sullivan's perspective, which is mentioned in the sources. He suspects that male horniness and maybe even aggression are more fundamentally rooted in nature, likely driven by T, rather than being solely products of society or patriarchy.
Because he lives in a world without women, essentially.
That's his argument, as presented in the source. He says, being gay, he exists in a social world largely without women, where traditional patriarchy by definition can't operate in the same way. Yet he observes male sexuality unleashed, as he puts it, with, quote, handsiness and groping and objectification and lust and aggression and passion and the ruthless pursuit of yet another conquest.
Wow.
His observation leads him to believe this intense, novelty-seeking sexual drive seems like a fundamental man thing, tied perhaps to T, not just something that emerges only in heterosexual interactions or specific social structures.
And the sources also seem to counter the idea that gay male promiscuity is just a result of a particular gay culture being permissive.
Right. Yes, they address that. They argue that while gay culture might be more accepting of multiple partners than mainstream straight culture often is, there's nothing inherently preventing lesbians from creating similar widespread hookup cultures if they were strongly inclined to do so. But generally speaking, they don't seem to the same extent.
So the argument is the culture reflects the underlying inclinations, not the other way around.
That's the argument presented, that gay and lesbian cultures largely seem to reflect the underlying average inclinations of the individuals within them. The simpler explanation, the sources suggest, is that individuals with male T levels, gay or straight, are, on average, more motivated to seek sex and variety, and gay men might just have more social freedom or opportunity to pursue that inclination compared to straight men constrained by female preferences or social norms.
Leading to that powerful framing for the sources. It's not a gay thing, it's a man thing. Quite a statement.
It is. It really centers the discussion back on the biological influence of T on these average behavioral patterns.
Okay, let's transition now to where the physical power of testosterone becomes incredibly, undeniably apparent. That's in the context of gender transition, which the sources discuss quite movingly.
Yes, this is where you see T's effects laid bare, almost. The sources note the significant rise in recent years in young people, especially those assigned female at birth, being referred to gender clinics, and consequently, a rise in the use of testosterone treatment for transitioning.
And male levels of T can have truly spectacular transformative effects on someone born female. Why is the body so responsive?
It comes back to those androgen receptors we talked about, the docking stations for testosterone. They're located on the X chromosome, so everyone has them, regardless of their birth sex. This means individuals born female have the cellular machinery ready to respond powerfully if exposed to high levels of testosterone, typical male levels.
And high T can even make more receptors.
Yes, high T can actually upregulate or stimulate the production of more of its own receptors in certain tissues, potentially amplifying its effects over time.
The example of Buck Angel in the sources is a really striking illustration. Born female, started T at age 28. The changes described are dramatic. Voice dropping significantly, clitoris increasing substantially in size, phallic clitoris, growing a full beard, gaining significant muscle mass with exercise.
It's a profound physical transformation. The sources also share the story of Alan, a trans man born female, who describes feeling from a very young age, like 3 or 4, that something about his body was fundamentally wrong, that it needed fixing.
A deep sense of incongruence.
Yes, he was a classic tomboy, mostly had male friends, really into sports, and he specifically talks about wishing he could have gone through male puberty earlier, particularly to gain more height, which is a T-driven effect.
And then they contrast this with Callisti, a trans woman born male, who transitioned in her early 30s after going through male puberty. She describes loving trying on her mom's clothes as a child, feeling gendered incorrectly, using clothes as a kind of costume to inhabit and express her inner feeling of being a girl.
These personal accounts really highlight why physical transition is often described as more challenging, or at least having more irreversible hurdles, in the male-to-female MTF direction compared to the female-to-male FTM direction, especially if someone undergoes natal male puberty first.
Because T during male puberty produces these really noticeable, enduring secondary sex characteristics.
Exactly. Things like broad shoulders, a square jawline, significant height increase, a deep voice, an Adam's apple. These are strong male cues driven by T, and they are very difficult, sometimes impossible, to fully undo or reverse later, even with estrogen therapy and T blockers. These are often undesirable features for someone transitioning MTF, but they are precisely the effects desired by someone transitioning FTM.
The sources go into detail on some of these specific T-induced masculine features. First, the deep voice. They even mention the historical example of castrati boys castrated before puberty, specifically to prevent their voices from deepening for singing.
It really underscores the power of T on the vocal cords and larynx. During male puberty, T levels surge 20 to 30 times higher than typical female levels, and this dramatically alters the larynx, the voice box.
How did it do that?
T interacts with those androgen receptors in the larynx tissues, causing them to elongate and bulk up. This increases the overall diameter of the larynx. Critically, it thickens and lengthens the vocal folds, the parts that actually vibrate to produce sound.
Like stretching a rubber band.
Exactly. The sources use that analogy. A longer, thicker rubber band vibrates slower, producing a lower pitch. T also builds up the laryngeal ligaments and muscles, promotes growth in facial bones like the jaw and sinuses, which affects resonance, and lowers the position of the larynx in the neck, allowing for more powerful, louder projection. It's a whole package of changes.
And once T has caused those structural changes to the vocal folds themselves, they can't just shrink back if T is removed or estrogen is added later.
That's what the sources state. Those structural changes to the vocal fold length and thickness are essentially permanent. Modifying them significantly would typically require specialized surgery, like vocal fold surgery.
So for FTM individuals starting T,
Their voice typically starts dropping noticeably within 2 to 5 months and usually stabilizes within about a year. It might not always reach the same depth as someone who went through natal male puberty, but it's usually a significant permanent drop.
but for MTF individuals who have been through male puberty.
Their larynx and vocal folds were permanently altered, enlarged, and thickened by that T exposure. This limits their upper pitch range naturally. Voice therapy can help immensely with pitch, resonance, and intonation patterns to sound more feminine, but it often can't fully override those fundamental acoustic cues created by the T-altered structure. Callisti's experience, as described, highlights this ongoing challenge.
What about the Adam's apple, that visible lump?
Yeah, that prominent Adam's apple is actually the thyroid cartilage, the front part of the larynx. It grows much more significantly under the influence of T during male puberty compared to female puberty, where it doesn't grow much at all, so it becomes another visible external marker of having gone through T-driven puberty.
And then, of course, there's facial and body hair. Another very visible T effect.
Absolutely. Thick, dark facial and body hair is a powerful masculine cue. Testosterone is the primary driver here, stimulating specific hair follicles to produce coarser, darker hair. Interestingly, T stimulates hair follicles almost everywhere except on the scalp, where high levels of its derivative, DHT, can actually lead to reduced hair density or male pattern baldness in susceptible individuals.
So T dictates which follicles become active, leading to beards, chest hair, back hair, etc.
Exactly. And the results can be quite striking for trans men. Someone like Alan, mentioned in the sources, who started T younger at 13, might develop a moderate beard. Others who start later, like Buck Angel at 28, can still develop full, dense beards. This is often a highly desired and affirming effect for trans men, and T definitely delivers it.
In contrast, for someone transitioning MTF who has gone through male puberty, what happens to that T-induced hair?
Even with T levels dropping significantly due to blockers or with estrogen therapy, those facial and body hair follicles that were activated by T become less active. The hair might grow thinner, less dark, and slower, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. Those follicles remain. So achieving smooth skin typically requires ongoing, often lifelong hair removal treatments like laser or electrolysis.
It really drives home just how profoundly and often permanently testosterone shapes our physical development, especially during that crucial window of puberty.
It really does. The physical effects are undeniable.
Okay, let's zoom back out now and talk about some of the broader implications of all this research as highlighted in the sources. They touch on some incredibly difficult and sensitive issues, like trying to understand sexual assault, and they even mention the author's own struggle grappling with evolutionary explanations for something as horrific as rape.
Yes, the author shares that personal struggle, finding such explanations deeply troubling initially because, as they put it, they can sound like they're somehow making rape seem natural or even excusable, which of course it isn't.
Right.
But the crucial point the sources emphasize is that understanding a potential evolutionary or biological explanation for any behavior, however abhorrent, never makes that behavior morally excusable or acceptable. It simply provides a framework for trying to understand why certain tendencies or patterns might exist in the first place, allowing us to evaluate the evidence dispassionately.
Like trying to understand the mechanism without justifying the act.
Exactly. The author mentions a professor's rather blunt response to their struggle, quote, "Keep calm and carry on," as a tough but ultimately valuable lesson in the necessity of considering difficult evidence objectively, even when it's emotionally challenging.
The sources also bring up that controversial concept sparked by Susanna Denuta Walters' Washington Post opinion piece, Hate All Men.
Yes, they discuss her article, which was actually titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And in it, she answers her own question with a resounding, quote, "We can." She cites statistics on male violence and the persistent underrepresentation of women in positions of power as reasons for this stance.
And the sources handle this neutrally.
Yes, they report this viewpoint factually as it was presented in her piece, noting that it generated significant controversy and backlash, but also found defenders highlighting the context of free expression rights surrounding such provocative statements. They don't endorse it, just report it as part of the conversation the sources engaged with.
But the sources don't just leave it there. They offer a counterpoint or some necessary nuance to that idea, right?
Right.
They argue that while men, on average, are clearly different in significant ways, particularly regarding physical aggression, as we've discussed, it's also important not to overlook virtues or positive behaviors that the sources suggest might be statistically preferentially handed to men or more commonly expressed by them.
Such as?
Things like being heavily overrepresented in dangerous jobs, construction, firefighting, military policing, often putting their lives on the line, roles involving protecting and educating others. And they make the important point that men are also, by far, the primary victims of male violence worldwide. So a simple all men are the problem narrative misses a lot of that complexity.
So the ultimate conclusion the sources seem to draw is pretty emphatic.
Yes, the answer is not to attack the science that helps us understand these observations, however uncomfortable they might be. And it's certainly not to hate men or to demonize testosterone itself.
They really emphasize the value of science here, don't they? Arguing that scientists maybe have a responsibility to better educate the public about the biological roots of sex differences. They do. They see this research not just as technically fascinating, but as potentially life-changing in its ability to help us understand ourselves and each other better.
They also stress that science is just one lens, one way to understand the human experience, alongside art, literature, travel, personal reflection, all of that.
For sure. But they argue that science, with its tools of statistics, hypothesis testing, understanding biology, using logic, uniquely equips us to process information critically in a world just flooded with overload, propaganda, misinformation, conspiracy theories. They explicitly warn that bad science, even when mixed with good intentions or worthy causes, is ultimately problematic and can lead us astray.
Bringing back that comparison to chimpanzees, like the story of the male chimp Imoso attacking Otamba, serves as a powerful, almost frightening reminder, doesn't it, of behavioral echoes we share with our closest relatives.
It's startlingly familiar sometimes, but humans are also fundamentally unique. The sources highlight that we actually have smaller average sex differences in many traits compared to chimps, partly because human pair bonding is more common, which likely reduced the intensity of male-male competition over evolutionary time compared to chimps.
And critically, we have these enormous brains.
Huge brains, and with them, This incredible capacity for self-reflection, for building sophisticated societies, for transmitting complex knowledge across generations through language and culture.
And that's the absolute key difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unlike chimpanzees, we can actually learn about our evolutionary origins and the intricate biochemical mechanisms, like testosterone's actions, happening inside our own bodies.
Exactly. The sources argue powerfully that this understanding, quote, gives us power over ourselves that no chimp comes close to having. Knowledge is empowering.
They also revisit that old idea, sometimes used to argue for equality, that the sexes must have basically the same brains. They call this a tired idea in the sources.
Yeah, they argue the evidence just doesn't support that. The sexes are different on average in brain structure and function, and many of those differences are traceable, at least in part, to differential androgen exposure both before birth and later in life.
But individuals vary hugely, of course.
Massively. The source author themselves mentions their own son wasn't into trucks, and how they personally preferred dismembering Barbie dolls to playing with boy toys as a kid. So individual variation is enormous and crucial. But they argue, despite that variation, consistent average patterns tied to biological sex definitely exist, and pretending they don't isn't helpful for understanding the world accurately.
And their final point in this whole section seems to be that understanding these differences isn't about hating anyone or justifying bad behavior or limiting potential. It's about gaining power through knowledge, power to understand ourselves, our tendencies, and our world more clearly.
Precisely. Knowledge as a tool for navigating reality, not denying it.
So pulling together everything we've explored in this deep dive today, we've seen how testosterone is deeply linked to fundamental reproductive functions and competition. We've seen how it influences aggression, but with really surprising nuances regarding sex differences, different types of aggression, and the importance of context and personality.
We've seen how it's a major player in male sexual motivation, and that strong, almost biological preference for novelty, the Coolidge effect, how its potential link to sexual orientation is incredibly complex, maybe stronger evidence in women via CAH than currently for men.
And just how profoundly T shapes our physical development, with those really stark examples from gender transition experiences.
And I think the real headline here, a thing to keep coming back to, is that testosterone isn't just some simple on-off switch for these behaviors. Its effects are powerful, absolutely, but they're constantly being modulated by our genetics, our individual personalities, the specific situation we find ourselves in, and the broader social and cultural context.
Yeah, it's not a magic potion turning meek men into warriors or anything simplistic like that.
Not at all. Its actions are potent, yes, but incredibly varied and context-dependent. It facilitates certain responses more than others, depending on the individual and the environment.
And yet, despite those biological predispositions and the consistent average patterns we do see often tied to biological sex, the sources really emphasize our human capacity. Our big brains, our ability to reflect, our incredibly complex societies. These give us this unique potential to understand and hopefully navigate these deep-seated influences in a way that no other animal possibly can.
That capacity for self-awareness and conscious choice, even in the face of biological influence, is key. Knowledge really is power in this domain.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with this final thought to maybe mull over based on everything we've unpacked from the sources today. Given this really intricate dance we've uncovered between our hormones like testosterone, our genes, our personal experiences, our environment, and those consistent patterns of behavior often tied to biological sex, how does grappling with this complex understanding shape your own ideas about individual choice, personal responsibility, and maybe even free will? Especially when it comes to navigating challenging human behaviors like aggression or managing complex social and sexual dynamics in our own lives.
Yeah, that's a deep one to ponder. How much are we driven and how much do we drive?